The rifle bucked against her shoulder at 0437 hours. The suppressed crack splitting the pre-dawn silence over the training range at forward operating base sentinel. 1,200 meters downrange. The target center mass punched inward, dead center. Same as the last 47 rounds she put to the same hole over the past 3 years. Sergeant Rachel Vance worked the bolt on her M110 semi-automatic sniper system. Without looking, her cheek never leaving the stock. The spent brass pinged against the concrete, still smoking in the mountain cold. She didn't need to check the scope. She already knew. Perfect. Again. Behind her, boots crunched on gravel. She tracked them by sound alone, the heavy, deliberate cadence of someone who wanted to be heard, someone who needed her to know they were coming. Vance. Captain Marcus Shaw's voice carried that particular tone she'd grown to recognize over 17 months of deployment, the one that said he was about to make a decision he knew was wrong, but lacked the spine to stop himself from making. Rachel didn't turn. She chambered another round. Sir, command meeting. Conference room. 0500. I'm on the range until 06. You were on the range until 06. Now you're in the conference room at 05. She finally lifted her head from the scope, turning just enough to see his silhouette against the purple mountain horizon. Shaw stood with his arms crossed, chin lifted the way small men do when they're trying to occupy more space than nature allotted them. What's this about, Captain? Shaw's jaw tightened. Just be there. He turned and walked back toward the operations center, his boots grinding against the gravel with every step. Rachel watched him go, her trigger finger resting against the guard of her rifle. She knew what this was about. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage under fire and hit that notification bell so you never miss one. Now, let me take you back to show you exactly how Sergeant Rachel Vance became the most dangerous soldier her own army couldn't control. The conference room at FOB Sentinel was built for function, not comfort. Plywood walls, fluorescent lights that buzz at a frequency designed to induce headaches, and a single window covered with blackout curtains that hadn't been opened in the 8 months since the base was established. A folding table dominated the center, surrounded by 12 metal chairs. 9 of them were already occupied when Rachel entered at 0459. Her entire unit sat in a rough semicircle. Sergeant First Class Morrison, Staff Sergeant Chun, Corporals Davis, Whitmore, and Reyes, and the 4 specialists who rounded out the reconnaissance team she'd served with since arriving in country. Every face she trusted, every soldier she bled beside. None of them would meet her eyes. Captain Shaw stood at the head of the table, a manila folder open in front of him. Beside him sat a face Rachel didn't recognize, a colonel with legal insignia, his expression professionally blank in a way that screamed JAG involvement. Sergeant Vance. Shaw gestured to the empty chair at the far end of the table. Sit. She didn't move. I'll stand, sir. Whatever this is, I'd rather take it on my feet. Shaw's left eye twitched, a tell she'd cataloged months ago, right around the time she started questioning his tactical calls in the field. The twitching always preceded his worst decisions. Fine. He picked up a sheet of paper from the folder. This is a unit cohesion assessment. Command has received multiple formal complaints regarding your conduct, your attitude, and your, he paused, as if tasting the word before spitting it out, your destabilizing influence on operational effectiveness. Rachel's expression didn't change, but something cold settled into her chest. Complaints from whom? Shaw didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way Morrison suddenly found the table's surface fascinating, the way Chen's jaw clenched. She could read the room like she read wind charts, like she read bullet trajectories. They'd voted. After careful consideration, Shaw continued, his voice taking on a rehearsed quality of a man reading from a script someone else had written. Command has determined that your continued presence in this unit represents an unacceptable risk to mission success and team morale. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Rachel let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds before speaking. An unacceptable risk. She turned the phrase over, examining it from every angle. Is that what we're calling it now? Sergeant. Because last month at Kandara Pass, when the drones were grounded and the wind was gusting at 23 knots, I put a round through a high-value target's left eye socket at 1,800 meters, while he was moving. Her voice stayed level, almost conversational. Saved 47 lives that day. Good soldiers. You're soldiers, Captain. Shaw's face reddened. That action is not relevant to... Funny thing about that mission. Rachel took one step toward the table, and Morrison flinched. I read the after-action report. Checked it 3 times, actually, because I thought there must have been some mistake. Her eyes found Shaw's and held them. My name wasn't anywhere in it. 47 lives saved by precise fire support. That's what it said. Fire support. Like I was an artillery piece. The JAG colonel shifted in his seat, his pen pausing over his notepad. You know what else was interesting? Rachel continued. The commendation that came down from battalion for that engagement. The one that praised exceptional tactical leadership under adverse conditions. That commendation had your name on it, Captain. Not mine. That's enough, Sergeant. Is it? She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes that dared to meet hers. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you didn't bring me here to discuss unit cohesion. You brought me here to bury me. Same way you buried what happened at Kandara. Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice rough. Vance, this isn't personal. Don't. The single word cracked like a rifle shot. Don't you dare tell me this isn't personal, Morrison. We've been in the same foxhole for 13 months. You've seen what I can do. You know what I've given to this unit. She turned back to Shaw. So let's skip the bureaucratic theater. What's really happening here? The captain's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. Rear echelon logistics at Camp Resolute. Your weapon will be confiscated pending a formal review of your conduct. The words hit harder than she'd expected. Not the reassignment. She'd seen that coming for months. But the rifle. They were taking her rifle. My M110 was issued to me personally by Special Operation Command. Yes, but you're no longer operating under SOC authority. You're under my command, and I'm exercising my discretion to secure that weapon until the review is complete. Shaw's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Think of it as an opportunity, Sergeant. Some time away from the front lines might help you gain perspective. Rachel stood motionless, her hands steady at her sides, even as something cracked inside her chest. 3 years. 3 years of dawn patrols and midnight extractions, of watching through her scope as men, who would never know she existed, continue breathing, because she'd chosen to let them. 3 years of being the best at something the Army claimed to value, and this was the reward. Discard, just like her father. She thought of him then, as she always did in moments like this. Staff Sergeant William Vance, Marine Corps veteran. 2 tours in a war nobody talked about anymore. He'd come home with medals on his chest and something broken behind his eyes. The VA had called it adjustment difficulties. The Marines had called it service-related. His daughter had called it what it was, a wound the military inflicted and then refused to treat. He'd put his service pistol in his mouth when Rachel was 16. The note he'd left was 3 words long. I'm sorry, baby. She joined the Army at 18, not to follow in his footsteps, but to understand what had destroyed him, to find the seam in the institution that had chewed him up and spit him out. And now, standing in this plywood conference room surrounded by the men who'd once called her sister, she finally understood. The seam was everywhere. The whole damn thing was made of seams. You'll surrender your weapon to Sergeant Morrison, Shaw said. Transport to Camp Resolute leaves at 0800. Dismissed. Rachel didn't move. She held Shaw's gaze for a long moment, letting him see exactly what was behind her eyes. Not anger, not despair, but something colder. Something that made the JAG colonel reach unconsciously for the sidearm he wasn't wearing. Yes, sir, she finally said, each syllable carved from ice. She turned and walked out of the conference room, her boots hitting the floor with the same measured precision she brought to everything. Behind her, she heard Shaw exhale, heard Morrison mutter something about for the best, heard the relieved shuffling of men who just successfully disposed of a problem they created. None of them understood. They thought they'd neutralize her. They thought by taking her rifle and banishing her to a logistics depot 40 kilometers from the front lines, they'd eliminated the threat she represented to their comfortable mediocrity. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Camp Resolute sat in a valley between two mountain ridges. Its collection of prefabricated buildings and motor pool tents arranged in the standard grid pattern that military planners applied to every theater regardless of terrain or tactical sense. It was a supply hub, a transit point, a place where soldiers waited to go somewhere that mattered. For Rachel Vance, it was purgatory. She'd been assigned to the Equipment Accountability Office, a corrugated metal building that smelled of diesel and old paper. Her duties consisted of tracking serialized items across 3 forward operating bases: weapons, optics, communications gear, all cataloged in a database that crashed every time the generators hiccuped. The first week, she'd reorganized the entire filing system. The second week, she'd identified 14 discrepancies in the inventory logs that suggested either incompetence or theft. The third week, she'd reported those discrepancies to the depot commander, a major who'd looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Sergeant," he'd said, pinching the bridge of his nose, "do you understand that some problems are better left unfound?" She understood. She just didn't agree. Now, on her 19th day of exile, Rachel sat in the corner of the mess hall with her back to the wall and her eyes on every entrance. Old habits, the kind that kept snipers alive in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. The television mounted above the serving line played AFN News on mute, closed captions scrolling across footage of somewhere that wasn't here. Rachel wasn't watching. She was studying the tactical map she'd memorized before they'd stripped her access, tracing the mountain routes in her mind, calculating distances, wind patterns, fields of fire. The Casra Valley, 23 kilometers of narrow passes and exposed ridgelines, connecting the enemy-held highlands to the civilian population centers below. Intelligence had flagged it as a likely transit corridor for weapons and fighters, but the terrain was too dangerous for ground operations and too complex for drone coverage. Someone would have to go in eventually. Someone would have to map those positions, identify those bunkers, eliminate those threats. It wouldn't be her. The seat taken? Rachel looked up. A woman in captain's bar stood with a meal tray in her hands, her uniform marked with the cross flags of military intelligence. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that had seen enough to know what they were looking at. "Captain Foster." Rachel's voice was neutral. "Didn't expect to see you out here. I go where the intelligence goes." Foster set her tray down and sat without waiting for an invitation. "Heard about your reassignment. Word travels fast in small commands." "I'm sure it does." Foster took a bite of what the menu optimistically called meatloaf. "Also heard about Kandara Pass. The real version, not the one that made it into the reports." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that right? 1,800 meters. Crosswinds that grounded our UAVs. Moving target." Foster set down her fork and met Rachel's gaze directly. "I've been in this theater for 11 months, Vance. I've seen a lot of soldiers claim a lot of things. But the signals intercept we pulled after that mission told a different story than the official record. The enemy was screaming about a ghost, a phantom shooter they never saw. They lost their entire command element in one engagement, and they had no idea where the round came from." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. "Why are you telling me this?" Rachel finally asked. Foster leaned forward slightly. "Because in about 6 hours, 3 companies from the 4th Battalion are going to push into the Casra Valley. 1,200 soldiers. Alpha, Bravo, and Delta companies. The mission brief calls it a reconnaissance in force. What it actually is someone's career move." Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Casra is a kill box. The terrain favors defenders at every choke point. If they don't have real-time drone coverage, they don't. Assets were redirected to support an operation in the southern sector. Someone with stars on their collar decided that the political optics of hitting a known target outweighed the tactical necessity of protecting an actual advance. That's insane, negligent, possibly criminal. Foster's jaw tightened. Yes, to all the above. Rachel's hands had curled into fists beneath the table. 1,200 soldiers. 3 full companies. Walking into terrain that would favor their enemies at every turn, without the air support that modern doctrine considered mandatory. "Why are you telling me this, Captain?" I'm stuck at a desk 40 clicks from the fight. There's nothing I can do. Foster reached into her cargo pocket and produced a small piece of paper, folded twice. She slid across the table, without breaking eye contact. The motor pool loses track of vehicles sometimes, especially the reconnaissance variants with the extended fuel tanks. And I happen to know that the evidence lockup where they're storing your M110 has a shift change at 0430. The duty guard usually takes a smoke break, about 12 minutes. Rachel stared at the paper, without touching it. You're asking me to go AWOL. I'm not asking you anything, Sergeant. I'm telling you what I know. Foster stood, picking up her tray. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. She walked away without looking back. Rachel sat alone in her quarters until 0300 hours, staring at the wall. The folded paper sat on the footlocker beside her rack, unopened. She didn't need to read it. Foster wouldn't have handed her anything she couldn't verify independently. The woman was intelligence. She dealt in facts. 1,200 soldiers. Rachel closed her eyes and ran the math. The Kasra Valley was 23 kilometers of ambush terrain. If the enemy had fortified the high ground, and they would have, because anyone with basic tactical sense would have, then those 3 companies would be walking into interlocking fields of fire with no overhead support and limited evacuation routes. Alpha, Bravo, and Delta, 1,200 men and women who'd wake up in a few hours thinking they were going on a routine operation. Some of them were probably writing letters home right now. Some of them were probably sleeping or playing cards, or doing all the small human things soldiers did to fill the hours before combat. They didn't know they were being fed into a grinder, but she knew, and knowing changed everything. Rachel's father used to say that knowledge was a weapon, that once you understood something, truly understood it, you became responsible for what you did with that understanding. He'd been talking about the things he'd seen overseas, the things the Corps had asked him to do that had slowly eaten him alive from the inside. She'd spent years being angry at him for leaving, for not being strong enough to carry what he'd carried. But now, sitting in the dark with 1,200 lives balanced against her own survival, she finally understood. It wasn't about strength. It was about choices. At 0347, she unfolded the paper. The contents were exactly what she'd expected. Motor pool access codes, evidence lockup location, shift change times, GPS coordinates for a route that would take her within 2 kilometers of the Kasra Valley's eastern approach, close enough to be useful, far enough to avoid the initial contact. At the bottom, in Foster's precise handwriting, asterisk the mission brief coordinates were flagged by SIGINT as potentially compromised. Nobody listened. 23 degrees 14 minutes north, 58 degrees 47 minutes east. Enemy observation post. Not the empty ridge the planners think it is. Asterisk. Rachel read the coordinates twice, then burned the paper with her lighter. At 0412, she slipped out her quarters. The night was cold, the kind of mountain cold that seeped through layers and settled into bones. She moved in the spaces between the security lights, her body remembering patterns she'd learned in places far more dangerous than this. The motor pool guards were playing a card game in a heated shack near the main gate. They didn't see her pass within 15 meters of their position. The reconnaissance Humvee was exactly where Foster's intel said it would be, 3rd row from the fence, partially hidden behind a broken-down supply truck, extended fuel tanks, mounted communications suite, and in the back, where someone had conveniently left the cage unlocked, a tactical surveillance kit, night vision optics, and a GPS unit that hadn't been wiped since its last mission. Rachel loaded the kit and moved to the evidence lockup. The duty guard was a specialist she vaguely recognized. Young, tired, probably on his 4th or 5th night rotation in a row. His smoke break was predictable. 0431, stepping outside to lean against the building and scroll through his phone. She had the door open in 40 seconds. Her M110 was tagged and cased on the second shelf on the left, exactly where the confiscation log said it would be. She checked the action, verified the zero hadn't been tampered with, and loaded both 20-round magazines she found in the case. The familiar weight settled against her shoulder like a missing limb restored. By 0447, she was rolling toward the perimeter. The checkpoint guard flagged her down, his flashlight sweeping across the windshield. Rachel kept her face neutral, her hands visible on the wheel. Sergeant Vance, equipment accountability. She held up a clipboard she'd fabricated 2 days earlier, anticipating this exact moment. Emergency delivery to FOB Sentinel. Some idiot lost his sinkers, and the old man is losing his mind. The guard squinted at the clipboard, then at her, then shrugged. It was 0500 on a Friday, and nobody wanted to be the one delaying an equipment run that some colonel was personally tracking. Safe travels, Sergeant. Always. She drove through the checkpoint and into the darkness beyond. The first checkpoint was the easy part. Once she was officially AWOL, once the morning accountability found her rack empty and her assigned vehicle missing, there would be no going back. Court-martial, brig time, dishonorable discharge, everything she'd built since her father's death, every step she'd taken to understand what the military had done to him would be erased. But 1,200 soldiers were heading into the Castro Valley with compromised coordinates and no air support. Rachel pressed the accelerator and watched the base lights fade in her mirror. She'd made her choice. The Castro Valley announced itself with the sound of distant thunder. Rachel had positioned her vehicle in a concealed draw 2 kilometers from the eastern approach, just as Foster's intel suggested. From her observation point on the ridge above, she could see the valley floor spreading out below, a narrow corridor of broken terrain flanked by ridgelines that offered perfect defensive positions for anyone smart enough to occupy them. The enemy was smart enough. Through her scope, she counted positions. Fortified bunkers dug into the northern slope, their firing ports oriented to cover the primary approach routes. Machine gun nests at 300-meter intervals, creating interlocking field of fire that would turn any ground advance into a meat grinder. And on the high ground at the far end of the valley, exactly where Foster's compromised coordinates had indicated empty terrain, an observation post with communications gear and what looked like a command element. 1,200 soldiers were about to walk into this. The thunder wasn't thunder. It was artillery. Incoming. Rachel checked her watch. 0147. The advance had already begun, which meant the enemy knew they were coming. The coordinates weren't just compromised. They'd been turned into an ambush grid. Whoever had leaked the operational data had given the enemy everything they needed to prepare. The first distress calls crackled across her stolen radio at 0153. This is Delta 6. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions, requesting immediate air support. Delta 6, this is Overlord. All air assets are currently committed to operations in the southern sector. Divert is not authorized at this time. Overlord, you don't understand. We have casualties. They've got the high ground and they're chewing us apart. Copy, Delta 6. Hold your position. QRF is being assembled. Rachel's jaw clenched. QRF, quick reaction force, meant another 2 hours minimum before any relief arrived. In that time, with the position she was looking at, Delta Company would be reduced to body bags. She unfolded her bipod and settled the M110 against her shoulder. The first target was a machine gun crew 400 meters below her position, laying suppressive fire into what she guessed was Delta's left flank. 3 men, 1 PKM, ammunition boxes stacked beside a sandbag emplacement. They were focused downrange, completely unaware of the angel of death positioning herself above them. Rachel calculated windage. 7 knots from the east, steady. Elevation, negligible at this range. Temperature, -2 Celsius, affecting powder burn by approximately 3%. She exhaled half her breath and held. The rifle whispered. The gunner slumped over his weapon, and for a moment his assistant thought he'd simply shifted position. Then the second round arrived, and the assistant was down. The third man had 2 seconds to register confusion before the third round found the bridge of his nose. Rachel was already shifting to her second target. Over the next 47 minutes, she dismantled 4 machine gun positions, killed 11 enemy fighters, and broke the stranglehold that had been choking Delta Company's eastern flank. She fired 17 rounds, reloaded once, and never stayed in the same position for more than 2 minutes. The radio traffic changed. Overlord, this is Delta 6. The fire on our flank has stopped. I don't know what happened, but they're not shooting. Copy, Delta 6. Recommend you capitalize and push the secondary rally point. Already moving. We got wounded, but we're mobile. Rachel allowed herself 3 seconds of satisfaction before checking her map. Delta was moving, but Alpha and Bravo were still out there, still fighting in terrain designed to kill them. She broke down her position and moved. The second engagement found her 600 meters above a ravine where Bravo Company survivors, she counted maybe 20 from their original force, had taken cover behind a collapsed section of rock. They were pinned by a heavy weapons team position on the opposite slope, the steady thump of a DSHK heavy machine gun echoing off the valley walls. The range was 640 meters. Child's play for her M110, but the angle was wrong. She couldn't get a clear shot on the gun crew without exposing her own position to a secondary emplacement she'd spotted 300 meters to her left. She had to move. 15 minutes later, having crawled 200 meters through scrub brush that tore her uniform and face, Rachel found her angle. 2 shots, 2 kills. The DSHK fell silent. This is Bravo Actual. Someone just killed a gun that was eating us alive. Does anyone have eyes on a friendly sniper? No one answered. Rachel was already moving again. The third engagement was the hardest. By 0700, Rachel had covered 8 kilometers of the worst terrain she encountered in 3 years of deployment. Her water was gone. Her ammunition was down to 23 rounds, and she'd picked up a piece of shrapnel somewhere that had opened a 4-inch gash along her left forearm. She'd bandaged it with her spare undershirt and kept moving. The radio traffic told a story of systematic destruction. Alpha Company had been hit hardest. Their initial push had walked directly into the kill zone that Foster's coordinates had warned about, and they'd lost 60 soldiers in the first 40 minutes of contact. The survivors had scattered into the mountain caves on the valley's northern face, but now they were trapped, surrounded by enemy forces who knew exactly where they were. And hovering above those caves, clearly visible through Rachel's scope from her current position 3 kilometers away, were 2 enemy helicopters. Not attack helicopters. Transport birds, but armed with door-mounted guns and carrying what looked like additional troops. They were circling, waiting. The moment Alpha tried to break out of those caves, the helicopters would cut them down from above. Rachel studied the problem through her scope. The helicopters were at approximately 1,500 meters altitude, moving at perhaps 40 knots in a lazy circuit pattern. Their door gunners were scanning the terrain below, but their attention was focused on the cave entrances, not the ridgeline where a lone sniper lay hidden in the brush. 1,500 meters to a moving target traveling at 40 knots. It was impossible. The math didn't work. At that range, with that movement, accounting for lead time and bullet drop and the goddamn wind that never stopped blowing in these mountains, there was no shot. No human being could make that shot. Rachel began calculating. Bullet drop at 1,500 meters, approximately 600 inches. Lead on a 40-knot target, roughly 80 feet. The helicopter's tail rotor was her only viable target. A small cluster of spinning blades that, if struck, would send the bird into an uncontrollable spin. It was impossible. But 83 soldiers were trapped in those caves, and 2 helicopters were the only thing standing between them and survival. She exhaled. The rifle spoke. The round traveled for 2.3 seconds, an eternity of physics and prayer, and the accumulated skill of 3 years of training compressed into a single copper-jacketed moment. It struck the lead helicopter's tail rotor at exactly the wrong angle for the aircraft and exactly the right angle for the soldiers below. The helicopter lurched, pitched sideways, and began spiraling toward the valley floor. Rachel was already chambering her next round when the second helicopter banked hard, its pilot finally understanding that death was coming from somewhere he couldn't see. But the bank was predictable. She'd seen that evasion pattern 100 times in training videos, and her second shot was already in the air before he finished the maneuver. The round found a tail assembly. Both helicopters went down within 90 seconds of each other. This is Alpha 6. The helicopters are down. I say again, the helicopters are down. All elements prepare to move. Rachel collapsed against a rock behind her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her shoulder throbbed from the recoil. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that always followed the impossible. 2 helicopters, 1,500 meters, moving targets. Her father would have been proud. The thought hit her unexpectedly, bringing moisture to eyes she trained to stay dry. William Vance had been a scout sniper, one of the best the Marines ever produced. And he carried that skill home with him like a tumor that slowly killed everything it touched. He'd taught her to shoot before the darkness took him, long afternoons at the range, his patient voice guiding her through breath control and trigger discipline, and all the mechanical skills that made a person into a weapon. He'd never taught her how to put the weapon down. Neither had anyone else. But that was a problem for later. Right now, 83 soldiers were streaming out of those caves, and they needed cover for the extraction. Rachel checked the remaining ammunition, 11 rounds. She picked her next target. The final engagement of the day wasn't a battle. It was an execution. By 0900, Rachel had positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the enemy command post that Foster's intelligence had identified. The observation point at 23 degrees 14 minutes north, 58 degrees 47 minutes east that the mission planners had dismissed as an empty ridgeline. It wasn't empty. It was the nerve center of the entire ambush. Through her scope, she watched officers moving between sandbag positions, coordinating defensive operations that had nearly destroyed 3 American companies. Radio operators hunched over their equipment, relaying orders. A makeshift field hospital treated wounded fighters who'd been carried back from a valley floor. These were the men who'd planned the slaughter, who'd used compromised intelligence to turn a routine operation into a massacre. The range was 3,847 meters. Rachel stared at the number on her laser rangefinder for a full 30 seconds, certain she'd made an error. She ranged again. Same number. She calculated the distance using terrain features and map coordinates, triple-checking her work. 3,847 meters. Nearly 4 kilometers. At the absolute edge of what her M110 could achieve, arguably beyond it. The bullet would travel for over 4 seconds, dropping more than 100 feet during flight. Wind drift at that range would push the round nearly 15 feet off target if her calculations were wrong by even half a degree. It was the kind of shot that existed only in legend, the kind of shot that instructors used as hypothetical examples of what was physically impossible. Rachel began building her firing solution. Bullet drop, approximately 1,200 inches. She would have to aim at a point in the sky nearly 100 feet above her actual target. Wind drift, 14-knot crosswind from the northwest, calculated at approximately 180 inches of horizontal displacement. Spin drift, 24 inches to the right, accounting for the right-hand twist of her rifle's barrel. Coriolis effect, 8 inches to the west, because at this range, the rotation of the Earth itself became a factor. Temperature, -2 Celsius, reducing muzzle velocity by approximately 40 feet per second. Barometric pressure, dropping, which would slightly alter air density and bullet behavior. Flight time, 4.2 seconds at an estimated muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. She input every variable, double-checked every calculation, then threw out her own work and started over from scratch. At this range, there was no margin for error, no second chances. One round, one target, one moment in which everything she'd ever learned would either save lives or end in failure. The command post senior officer stepped out of the main bunker, a radio handset pressed to his ear. Through her scope, Rachel could see his lips moving, could see the frustration on his face as he received reports of the helicopters going down, the flanking positions being silenced, the ambush falling apart. He was trying to save his operation. She was about to end it. Rachel settled her breathing, found the moment between heartbeats, aligned her crosshairs on a point in empty air that existed only in her calculations, the intersection of physics and faith that would guide her bullet home. The rifle spoke. For 4.2 seconds, the world held its breath. The officer's head snapped back. His body crumpled. The radio handset clattered against the rocks. And across the valley, in every defensive position still manned by enemy fighters, communications went silent because the round hadn't just killed a man. It had killed the man giving orders. Over the next 3 hours, the enemy defense collapsed. Without coordination, without leadership, the remaining fighters fell back in disarray. American forces pushed through gaps that shouldn't have existed, recovering wounded soldiers and reclaiming ground that had been lost in the initial ambush. Final count. 129 American soldiers survived the Castro Valley operation. 40 from Delta Company, 6 from Bravo, 83 from Alpha, out of 1,200 who'd gone in. But 129 was 129 more than would have made it without a ghost sniper appearing from nowhere to tear the ambush apart from within. Rachel didn't stay to watch the extraction. By 1100, military police were already searching for her, having tracked the missing Humvee to the general vicinity. By 1200, her name was being broadcast on every command frequency as an AWOL suspect who had stolen classified equipment and violated direct orders. She made it 6 kilometers before the Black Hawk found her. The helicopter came in low and fast, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and gravel that forced Rachel to shield her eyes. She'd been moving through a dry riverbed, trying to put distance between herself and the valley, when the aircraft appeared over the ridgeline like a hunting hawk spotting prey. She was done. Her ammunition was gone. The last 3 rounds had been spent covering Alpha Company's extraction, and she hadn't found an opportunity to resupply. Her body was running on empty, the adrenaline long since burned away, leaving only exhaustion and the dull ache of the shrapnel wound she'd ignored for 8 hours. The Black Hawk touched down 50 meters ahead, and Rachel stopped walking. She recognized a figure that climbed out before the rotors stopped spinning. Captain Foster moved with purpose, her intelligence uniform looking oddly clean against the dust-covered landscape. Sergeant Vance. Rachel stood at attention, out of habit. Captain, you're a hard woman to track. Foster stopped 3 paces away, her expression unreadable. Military police have been chasing your signal for the past 6 hours. I told them you were probably dead, in a ditch somewhere, bought you some time. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Foster's jaw tightened. The charges against you are piling up. AWOL, theft of military property, unauthorized use of a weapon system, disobeying direct orders from your commanding officer. She paused. There's talk of adding desertion in the face of the enemy, which carries a potential death penalty under the UCMJ. Rachel absorbed this without reaction. She'd known the cost when she drove through that checkpoint. I understand. Do you? Foster took another step closer, lowering her voice. Because the Joint Operations Command is scrambling to explain how 3 companies walked into an ambush that killed over 1,000 soldiers, and they're looking for someone to blame. You just gave them a convenient target. The ambush wasn't my doing. I know that. You know that. The 129 soldiers currently being evacuated from the valley know that, even if they don't know your name. Foster reached into her cargo pocket and produced a small digital recorder, which is why I've been documenting everything since I handed you that paper in the mess hall. Rachel blinked. Ma'am, the compromised coordinates, the redirected drone coverage, the 14 requests for additional intelligence support that Captain Shaw personally rejected because he didn't want to delay his operational timeline. Foster's voice was cold. This wasn't just incompetence, Vance. This was institutional failure at multiple levels, and someone is going to answer for it. You're building a case. I'm preserving evidence. What happens to it depends on how the next 48 hours play out. Foster glanced toward the helicopter, where the crew chief was watching them with obvious curiosity. Right now, I need you to come with me. Voluntarily. The MPs are 15 minutes behind us, and if they get to you first, this becomes a lot messier. Rachel looked down at her empty hands. No rifle, no ammunition, no options. Where are we going? Camp Resolute. You're going to be placed in temporary custody while Theater Command figures out what to do with you. Foster met her eyes directly. And Vance, whatever happens next, don't say a word without legal representation present. Not to the MPs, not to Shaw, not to anyone. Understood? Yes, ma'am. They walked to the helicopter together. The flight back took 23 minutes. Rachel spent most of it staring out the window at the mountains sliding past below, her mind cataloging distances and angles out of pure habit. Somewhere down there, medics were loading wounded soldiers onto evacuation aircraft. Somewhere down there, graves registration teams were beginning the grim work of recovering the dead. 1,071 soldiers hadn't come home from the Castro Valley, but 129 had. And every single one of them was alive because a disgraced sniper had refused to accept that her war was over. The Black Hawk set down at Camp Resolute at 1,347 hours. A squad of military police was waiting on the landing pad, their faces set in professionally neutral expressions of men who'd been told to arrest a dangerous fugitive and found instead an exhausted woman covered in dust and dried blood. Sergeant Rachel Vance, the MP sergeant, announced, "You are under apprehension for violation of multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent." "She knows her rights," Foster interrupted. "Get her to medical first. She has a shrapnel wound that needs treatment." The MP looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Medical, then holding. Captain Shaw has requested to be present for the preliminary questioning. Captain Shaw can make requests all day long. Sergeant Vance will not be questioned until JAG Council is present." Foster stepped between Rachel and the MPs, her slight frame somehow managing to occupy more space than physics should allow. "That's not a suggestion. That's Article 31. The tension held for 3 long seconds before the MP nodded. "Understood, ma'am. We'll arrange your counsel." They led Rachel away. The holding facility at Camp Resolute was a converted shipping container with a cot, a toilet, and a single overhead light that buzzed at exactly the wrong frequency. Rachel lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, counting the minutes until whatever came next. She'd been treated by a medic who asked no questions, stitched up the shrapnel wound with 17 sutures, and handed her a bottle of water and 2 ibuprofen. No conversation, no curiosity, just efficient military health care delivered to a prisoner awaiting charges. The door opened at 1,600 hours. Captain Shaw stood in the entrance, his uniform freshly pressed, his face arranged in an expression of righteous satisfaction that made Rachel's fists clench involuntarily. Behind him, 2 MPs took positions on either side of the door. Sergeant Vance. His voice dripped with the particular condescension of a man who believed he'd finally won. "I hope you understand the severity of your situation." Rachel sat up slowly, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. "Captain, you went AWOL. You stole military equipment. You ignored a direct reassignment order and inserted yourself into an active combat zone without authorization." Shaw stepped into the container, the confined space somehow making him seem smaller. "You understand that I have no choice but to recommend court-martial? That the charges you're facing could result in decades of imprisonment? I understand what the charges are." "Good." Shaw's thin smile appeared. "Because I want you to understand something else, Vance. I want you to understand that this," he gestured around the holding cell, "is what happens when soldiers forget their place, when they decide that their judgment matters more than the chain of command." Rachel said nothing. "I gave you every opportunity," Shaw continued, warming to his theme. "Every chance to be part of this unit, to contribute within the structure that makes the military function. But you couldn't accept that, could you? You had to be special. You had to be the exception." "Sir," Rachel's voice was flat, "is there a point to this conversation?" Shaw's face reddened. "The point, Sergeant, is that you destroyed yourself. Your career is over. Your freedom is over. And when this reaches court-martial, I will personally ensure that the full weight of military justice." "Captain Shaw." The new voice came from the doorway. Both Shaw and Rachel turned to see a figure in a general's uniform stepping into the container. A tall, gray-haired man with the insignia of a 2-star and eyes that had seen more combat than everyone else in the room combined. Shaw snapped to attention, so fast Rachel heard his heels click. "General Hawthorne, sir. I wasn't informed you would be." "At ease, Captain." General Hawthorne's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise it to be obeyed. He surveyed the holding cell, his gaze lingering on Rachel's bandaged arm. The dust still caked in her hair, the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "Sergeant Vance," he said. "Sir, I've just spent the past 4 hours reviewing operational reports from the Castro Valley engagement. Interesting reading." He turned to Shaw. "Captain, are you aware that Delta Company's after-action report credits their survival to an unknown friendly sniper who eliminated 4 machine gun positions during their most critical moment?" Shaw's jaw worked. "Sir, Are you aware that Bravo Company's commanding officer, or what's left of their command element, has formally requested that this unknown friendly be identified and recommended for the Silver Star? General, this woman went AWOL. And are you aware, Captain, that Alpha Company survivors have already begun circulating stories about a ghost shooter who took down 2 enemy helicopters at over 1,000 meters, creating an extraction window that allowed 83 soldiers to escape what would otherwise have been certain death? The container fell silent. General Hawthorne reached into his jacket and produced a tablet, its screen glowing with data. I've also reviewed the intelligence assessments that Captain Foster has been compiling, the compromised coordinates, the rejected requests for drone support, the operational timeline that was prioritized over soldier safety. Shaw's face had gone pale. Sir, those assessments are accurate. Hawthorne's voice dropped to something approaching dangerous. They are extremely accurate, Captain. Accurate enough that Theater Command is launching a full investigation into the operational failures that led to the deaths of over 1,000 American soldiers. Rachel watched Shaw's world collapse in real time. Sergeant Vance, Hawthorne continued, turning back to her, is it your testimony that you violated orders when AWOL and inserted yourself into the Castro Valley engagement with a specific intent of providing support to units you believed were in imminent danger? Yes, sir. And is it your testimony that you observed defensive positions and tactical deployments that suggested the enemy had foreknowledge of our operational plan? Yes, sir. The observation post at 23 degrees 14 minutes north, 58 degrees 47 minutes east was fortified and manned, despite mission briefings indicating it was unoccupied. The ambush positions were too well prepared for a reactive defense. Someone gave them our approach routes. Hawthorne nodded slowly. Captain Shaw, you are hereby relieved of command pending investigation. You will surrender your sidearm to the military police and confine yourself to quarters until further notice. General, you can't. I can. I have. It's done. Hawthorne's eyes were cold. Get out of my sight, Captain, and pray that the investigation find incompetence rather than complicity. Because if I discover that American soldiers died because of something worse than stupidity, I will personally ensure that you spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. Shaw stumbled backward, his face gray, his hands shaking. The MPs escorted him out without a word. The silence that followed Shaw's departure stretched for nearly a minute. General Hawthorne stood in the center of the holding cell, his attention focused entirely on the woman sitting on the military cot. Rachel met his gaze without flinching. Whatever came next, she'd face it the same way she faced everything. Head on, eyes open, no apologies. Sergeant Vance, Hawthorne finally said, I have a problem. Sir, my problem is that I have a soldier who violated at least 4 articles of the UCMJ, who went AWOL during a combat deployment, who stole military equipment, and who inserted herself into an active engagement without authorization. He paused. That soldier's actions directly saved the lives of 129 American soldiers. Without her intervention, the casualty count from the Castro Valley would have been absolute. Rachel said nothing. I cannot publicly acknowledge what you did. The political implications, the questions it raises about operational security, about command failures, about how close we came to losing 3 entire companies, are beyond my authority to address. Hawthorne's voice hardened. But I also cannot, in good conscience, punish a soldier who demonstrated exactly the kind of independent judgment and tactical excellence that our training is supposed to produce. He reached into his jacket again, this time producing a small leather case. All charges against you are being dropped. The official record will show that you were temporarily reassigned to a classified operation during the Castro Valley engagement, that your actions during that operation were authorized under emergency protocols, and that the details remain sealed. Rachel blinked. Sir, I don't understand. You don't have to understand, Sergeant. You just have to accept that sometimes the system course corrects, even if it takes longer than it should. He opened the leather case, revealing a bronze star suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon. This is the Bronze Star with valid device. It is being awarded for exceptional gallantry in combat operations. It will appear in your permanent record without reference to the specific actions that earned it. He set the case on the cot beside her. Additionally, You are hereby promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant, effective immediately. Your transfer paperwork has been submitted to Special Operations Command, where I'm told they've been looking for someone with your particular talents. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. You'll fit in better there. The operators tend to appreciate soldiers who think for themselves. Rachel looked down at the medal, its surface gleaming under the harsh overhead light. 3 years of service. 3 years of being the best and being punished for it. 3 years of watching her father's fate lurk at the edges of her own career. The slow institutional grinding that turned weapons into casualties. And now this. Sir, she said slowly, I need to know, Captain Shaw, the compromise coordinates. Was it just incompetence, or the investigation will determine that? Hawthorne's voice allowed no argument. What I can tell you is that the operational failures were systemic enough to guarantee accountability at multiple levels. Shaw won't be the only one answering questions. Rachel nodded. It would have to be enough. One more thing, Hawthorne said, moving toward the door. Captain Foster's testimony was instrumental in this outcome. She took considerable professional risk in documenting what she observed and ensuring that documentation reached the right people. You might want to thank her when you have the chance. I will, sir. Hawthorne paused at the threshold, turning back for a final look. Staff Sergeant Vance, you made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances, and you made it right. The soldiers you saved will never know your name, but they'll go home to their families because of what you did. His voice softened. That's what service is supposed to be. Not blind obedience. Not career protection. Just the right thing, done when it matters. He left. Rachel sat alone in the holding cell that was no longer a prison, the Bronze Star heavy in her hands. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of a military base at work. Vehicles moving, voices calling, the endless rhythm of an institution that chewed through people without ever stopping to count the cost. But somewhere out there, 129 soldiers were still breathing. And somewhere, in whatever came after, her father was finally at peace. 3 weeks later, Rachel reported to Fort Bragg for Special Operations Assessment and Selection. The instructors had been briefed on her background. The impossible shots, the insubordination, the one-woman campaign that had turned an ambush into a rescue. They called her the ghost before she'd even finished in processing. She didn't correct them. In the years that followed, stories would circulate through special operations communities about a sniper who appeared in impossible places, who made shots that physics said couldn't be made, who operated alone in territory where survival required teams and support and all the institutional machinery that conventional forces depended upon. The stories were exaggerated, as stories always are, but the core truth remained. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon an army has is the one it keeps trying to discard. And sometimes, when everything falls apart, that weapon is the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Staff Sergeant Rachel Vance had learned that lesson from her father, who carried it home from a war and let it destroy him. She'd learned it again in the Castro Valley, where 1,200 soldiers walked into a trap, and only 129 walked out. But she'd also learned something else, something William Vance never had the chance to discover. The institution could be wrong. Authority could fail. Orders could lead to death rather than victory. And in those moments, the soldier who saw clearly had more than the right to act. She had the obligation. Rachel Vance had kept faith with that obligation when everyone around her had abandoned it. She'd paid the price in blood and exhaustion and the certainty of punishment, and she'd been rewarded with vindication. It wasn't supposed to work that way. The system wasn't supposed to correct itself. The soldier who defied orders wasn't supposed to be promoted and decorated and transferred to the one unit in the entire army that valued exactly what she brought. But sometimes it did. Sometimes the ghost won. And in the pre-dawn darkness of a training range at Fort Bragg, where new recruits were learning the skills that might one day save their lives, a familiar sound echoed across the firing line. The suppressed crack of a rifle. The distant impact of copper meeting target. Dead center. Same as always. The sunrise painted the mountains gold and amber. The same colors Rachel had watched her father disappear into all those years ago. But this time, the light felt different. Warmer. Like something finally coming home. She stood alone at the edge of the observation deck, her new unit insignia fresh on her sleeve, her rifle case resting against the railing beside her. In a few hours, she would begin the first phase of special operations training, the crucible that would determine whether she belonged in a community designed for soldiers like her. She already knew she belonged. The question was whether they would recognize it. A figure approached from behind, footsteps quiet on the wooden planking. Rachel turned to find Captain Foster, now Major Foster, holding 2 cups of coffee. Staff Sergeant. Foster handed her one of the cups. You look like you haven't slept. Old habit. Hard to break. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb above the ridgeline. I heard Shaw's investigation wrapped up, Foster said finally. Findings sealed, but multiple officers relieved the command. Someone's head rolled, just not publicly. Rachel sipped her coffee. Good enough. Is it? It has to be. Rachel turned to face her. You taught me that, Captain. Major, whatever happens in the institution happens slowly, and sometimes not at all. But what matters, what you can control, is the choice you make when nobody's watching. Foster's lips curved into something approaching a smile. You're going to do well here, Vance. These operators, they understand. Some of them have their own Castro valleys, their own moments where the chain of command failed, and they had to decide what mattered more. And they chose like I did. They're still here, aren't they? Rachel nodded slowly. Behind them, the training compound was coming alive. Voices calling, equipment being staged, the complex choreography of an elite unit preparing for another day of transforming soldiers into something more. She would be part of that now, not as an outsider, not as a problem to be managed, but as exactly what she'd always been, a weapon finally pointed in the right direction. 129 soldiers were alive because she'd refused to be discarded. And in a world full of institutions that chewed people up and spit them out, that single number was enough to justify everything. Sergeant Rachel Vance, the ghost, finished her coffee, picked up her rifle case, and walked toward the next mission. She was finally home,